The rain came down in sheets across the New Mexico territory, turning the dusty streets of Cimarron into rivers of mud. And through that deluge walked a woman with her face turned up toward the heavens, singing as if the storm itself existed solely to accompany her voice. Thomas Owen had been riding for 3 days straight, chasing rumors of work at the massive Maxwell Land Grant Ranch, when the downpour forced him to seek shelter under the overhang of what appeared to be a general store. His horse, a sturdy roan mare named Rosie, stood patiently beside him, ears flicking at the sound that cut through the rain like a silver thread. It took Thomas a moment to realize what he was hearing. A woman's voice, clear and pure, singing something he did not recognize but felt deep in his chest nonetheless. The melody was mournful yet hopeful, the kind of song that spoke of loss and redemption in equal measure. He stepped out from under the overhang, rain immediately soaking through his worn leather duster, and looked down the street. There she was, perhaps 30 yards away, standing in the middle of the muddy thoroughfare with her arms slightly outstretched, her dark hair plastered to her head and shoulders, her simple calico dress clinging to her frame. She was not performing for anyone. She was simply singing to herself, to the rain, to whatever spirit moved within her. Thomas felt something shift inside his chest, something he had never experienced in his 26 years of hard living and harder riding. It was as if every mile he had traveled, every dusty trail and lonely campfire, had been leading him to this exact moment in this exact place. The woman's song came to a natural end, and she lowered her face, opening her eyes as if waking from a dream. That was when she noticed Thomas standing there, staring at her like a fool in the rain. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, as if embarrassed to have been observed, the woman hurried toward the covered walkway on the opposite side of the street, disappearing into a doorway. Thomas stood there for another minute, rain running down his face, before leading Rosie toward the nearest stable. The old man running the place took his money and promised to give the mare a good rub-down and extra oats. Thomas paid for 3 days in advance, though he had only planned to stay 1 night at most. Something told him he would not be leaving Cimarron as quickly as he had arrived. The town was small but prosperous, owing to its position along the Santa Fe Trail and its proximity to the Maxwell Ranch, one of the largest land grants in the territory. The year was 1873, and New Mexico was still rough country, though less wild than it had been a decade prior. Thomas had been born in Texas, raised by a father who broke horses and a mother who died when he was 12. He had learned to rope and ride before he could raid, and he had spent the last 8 years drifting from ranch to ranch, never staying long enough to put down roots. He told himself he liked the freedom, but the truth was he had never found a reason to stop moving, until now. The saloon was called the St. James Hotel, a grand name for what was actually a fairly respectable establishment. Thomas pushed through the doors, shaking water from his hat, and approached the bar. The bartender, a thick-necked man with impressive mustaches, nodded at him. "Whiskey," Thomas said, placing a coin on the polished wood. "And information if you have got it." "Information costs more than whiskey," the bartender said, but he poured the drink anyway. "What are you looking for?" "Work. I heard the Maxwell outfit was hiring." "They are always hiring. Men do not last long out there. It is hard country and the pay is barely worth the trouble." The bartender leaned forward conspiratorially. "But if you are good with horses, you might try the Carson spread. Smaller operation, but they treat their men fair." "Carson," Thomas repeated, filing the name away. He took a sip of the whiskey, letting it burn down his throat. "Tell me about the woman who sings in the rain." The bartender's expression shifted, becoming guarded. "You saw Katherine Calloway." I heard her before I saw her, never heard anything like it. No, I do not expect you have. The bartender polished a glass thoughtfully. Katherine is the daughter of James Calloway, who used to run the newspaper here until he died of pneumonia 3 winters back. She stayed on, keeps the paper running, though most folks think it is not proper work for a woman. She is educated, can read and write better than most men in this territory, and she has got a voice that could make angels weep. But she is also stubborn as a Missouri mule and twice as ornery when crossed. She married. No, and not for lack of offers. She turned down 4 proposals that I know of, including one from Maxwell's foreman, which took some nerve. Most women out here would jump at the security. The bartender gave Thomas a measuring look. What is your interest? Thomas was not entirely sure how to answer that. I just never heard anyone sing like that before, he said finally. Like they meant every word, even without words. Katherine does everything like she means it. That is her blessing and her curse. The bartender moved away to serve another customer, leaving Thomas alone with his thoughts and his whiskey. He spent the night in a small boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson, who provided clean sheets and a hot breakfast for 50 cents. The room was sparse but adequate, with a narrow bed and a washstand. Thomas lay awake for a long time, listening to the rain hammer against the window, thinking about a woman singing in the storm. Morning brought clear skies and the sharp, clean smell of rain-washed earth. Thomas dressed in his best shirt, which was not saying much, and made his way to the newspaper office. It was a small building sandwiched between a saddle shop and a lawyer's office, with a hand-painted sign that read Cimarron Chronicle hanging above the door. Through the window, he could see Katherine Calloway bent over a desk, her dark hair tied back in a practical bun, spectacles perched on her nose as she examined what appeared to be a page of typeset. He stood there for a full minute, gathering his nerve, before pushing open the door. A bell chimed above his head and Katherine looked up, her eyes widening slightly in recognition. "You are the man from yesterday," she said. It was not a question. "The one who was staring at me in the rain." "I apologize for that," Thomas said, removing his hat. "I did not mean to intrude on a private moment. I just could not help but listen when I heard you singing. It was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard." Katherine's cheeks colored slightly, but her expression remained guarded. "That is kind of you to say, but I am quite busy at the moment. If you are looking to place an advertisement, I can help you with that. Otherwise, I must ask you to leave. I am not here for an advertisement. I am here because I wanted to apologize properly and to introduce myself. My name is Thomas Owen. I just arrived in town yesterday and I am looking for work." "Then you should try the ranches, not a newspaper office," Katherine said, turning back to her work. "Good day, Mr. Owen." Thomas stood there, hat in hand, feeling foolish, but something in him refused to simply walk away. "Why do you sing in the rain?" he asked. Katherine's hand stilled on the page of type. For a long moment she did not answer. Then, without looking up, she said quietly, "Because that is when no one is listening, or so I thought." "I will not tell anyone," Thomas said. "It can remain your secret." She did look up then, studying him with eyes that were a startling shade of green, sharp and intelligent and deeply wary. "Why do you care, Mr. Owen? You do not know me. For all you know, I could be touched in the head." "Maybe I am the one who is touched," Thomas admitted. "But I have been drifting for 8 years, never staying anywhere long enough to learn people's names, and yesterday when I heard you singing, it was like something in me just stopped running. I cannot explain it better than that." Katherine stood, and he realized she was taller than he had thought, perhaps 5.5 feet, with a straight-backed posture that spoke of pride and determination. "Life is not a fairy tale, Mr. Owen. You cannot simply ride into town and decide that a stranger's voice is your home. That is not how the world works. Maybe not, Thomas agreed, but I would like the chance to get to know you anyway if you will allow it. No expectations, no demands, just two people talking. I do not have time for talking. This newspaper does not run itself and I have a deadline to meet. But even as she said it, some of the hardness left her voice. If you are genuinely looking for work, there is a ranch about 5 miles west of here, the Carson place. The owner is a fair man, and they are looking for someone who knows horses. The bartender at the St. James mentioned it. I was planning to ride out there this afternoon. Thomas put his hat back on, preparing to leave. Thank you for the recommendation, Miss Calloway. How did you know my name? The bartender told me. I asked about the woman who sings in the rain. Catherine's expression softened almost imperceptibly. You should not believe everything you hear in a saloon, Mr. Owen. I will keep that in mind, Thomas said, and left before she could dismiss him again. The Carson Ranch was everything the bartender had promised. The owner, a weathered man in his 50s named Henry Carson, looked Thomas over with a practiced eye, asked him a few questions about his experience, and then took him out to the corral where a young stallion was bucking and fighting against the rope. Can you break him without breaking his spirit? Henry asked. Thomas studied the horse, noting the wild fear in its eyes, the way it fought not out of meanness but out of terror. I can try, but it will take time. You cannot rush a scared animal. That is the right answer, Henry said. You are hired. Pay is $30 a month plus room and board. We work sunup to sundown, and we do not tolerate drinking or gambling on the premises. Fair, fair, Thomas agreed and shook the man's hand. The work was hard but satisfying. Thomas spent his days working with the horses, slowly earning the trust of the wild stallion, whose name, he learned, was Thunder. In the evenings, he ate with the other ranch hands, a collection of weathered men who spoke little and worked hard. He learned that Henry Carson was a widower whose wife had died giving birth to their only child, a daughter who had moved back east to live with relatives. He learned that the ranch had been struggling until recently, when Henry had secured a contract to supply horses to the cavalry. And every Sunday, Thomas rode into town and found an excuse to visit the newspaper office. At first, Katherine was coolly polite, answering his questions about the town and the territory with the bare minimum of information. But Thomas was patient. He brought her small gifts, nothing fancy or expensive, just things he thought she might appreciate. A smooth river stone he had found while riding fence lines, a feather from a red-tailed hawk, a pressed wildflower. He never asked for anything in return, never pushed for more than she was willing to give. Slowly, over the course of weeks, her defenses began to crumble. She started asking him questions in return. About his childhood in Texas, about his years of drifting, about why he had never settled down. Thomas answered honestly, holding nothing back. He told her about his father's drinking, about the violence that had filled his childhood home, about his mother's death and his subsequent departure at age 18. He told her about the loneliness of the trail, the emptiness of saloons and borrowed beds. Why did you keep moving? Katherine asked one Sunday afternoon in late October. They were sitting on the bench outside her office, watching the town go about its business. The air had turned cool and Katherine wore a shawl over her shoulders. Because I did not have a reason to stop, Thomas said simply. Every place was the same as the last. Different faces, different landscapes, but the same emptiness. And you think Cimarron is different. I know it is. He looked at her, letting her see the sincerity in his eyes. You are here. Katherine looked away, but not before he saw the emotion flickering across her face. You do not really know me, Thomas. You have built me up in your mind into something I am not. Then let me know you. The real you, not the version I imagined. She was quiet for a long time, watching a wagon roll past, loaded with supplies. Then she said, "My father died 3 years ago, as you probably heard. What you might not know is that he drank himself to death. Not quickly, not all at once, but slowly over the course of years. My mother left when I was 10, could not take his darkness anymore, and it was just him and me after that. He was brilliant when he was sober, could write like an angel and argue like a lawyer, but the bottle had its hooks in him deep. I watched him waste away, and there was nothing I could do to stop it." "I am sorry," Thomas said quietly. "The newspaper was his life, and when he died, everyone expected me to sell it. A woman has no business running a paper, they said. But it was all I had left of him, the good parts of him, and I could not let it go. So I kept it running, learned the printing press, learned to set type, learned to write the way he had taught me. And every day, people look at me like I am some kind of curiosity, a woman doing a man's work, and I have to prove myself over and over again. That sounds exhausting." "It is," Katherine admitted. "And lonely. I have acquaintances, people I see at church and around town, but no real friends. No one who understands what it is like to be trapped between two worlds, not quite fitting in anywhere." Thomas understood that better than she knew. "Is that why you sing in the rain? To feel less alone?" Katherine turned to look at him, and he saw tears glimmering in her eyes. "My mother used to sing to me when I was small. It is one of the few memories I have of her. After she left, I used to sing the same songs to myself, pretending she was still there. It became a habit, a way to feel connected to something beyond myself. And the rain, it muffles the sound, makes it private, or it did until you came along." "I am glad I heard you," Thomas said. "I am glad the rain brought me to Cimarron. Are you? Even though I am difficult and stubborn and come with more baggage than a stage coach, especially because of all that," Thomas said, and he reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. She did not pull away. Her fingers were ink-stained and calloused from working the press, and they were the most beautiful thing he had ever held. They sat like that for a long time, hand in hand, watching the sun sink lower in the sky. When Thomas finally rode back to the Carson ranch that evening, he felt lighter than he had in years, as if some invisible weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The courtship progressed slowly, as autumn gave way to winter. Thomas continued his Sunday visits, but now Katherine welcomed him openly, even looking forward to his arrival. They took walks together, explored the hills around Cimarron, talked about everything and nothing. Thomas learned that Katherine loved books, that she had read everything from Shakespeare to the latest dime novels, that she dreamed of traveling to cities back east, but could not bring herself to leave the newspaper. He learned that she had a wicked sense of humor, that she could argue politics with the best of them, that she sang not just in the rain but sometimes while working the press, though she would stop immediately if anyone entered the office. Katherine learned that Thomas was gentle with animals but had a core of steel when pushed, that he had never learned to read beyond the basics, but was eager to improve, that he carried a battered photograph of his mother in his shirt pocket and sometimes talked to it when he thought no one was listening. She learned that he was patient and kind, that he never raised his voice in anger, that he looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. In December, the first snow fell, blanketing Cimarron in white. Thomas arrived at the newspaper office to find Katherine struggling with a broken window pane, cold air streaming into the building. Without a word, he rode back to the ranch, returned with tools and a piece of glass Henry Carson had donated, and spent the afternoon repairing the window. Katherine made coffee and watched him work, and when he was finished, she kissed him. It was not their first kiss. They had shared a few tentative moments over the past months, but this one was different. This one was a promise, a commitment, a declaration. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Thomas said, "I love you, Katherine Calloway. I have loved you since the moment I heard you singing in the rain." "I love you too," Katherine whispered. "I fought against it, tried to convince myself it was too fast, too improbable, but I cannot deny it anymore. You are the best thing that has ever happened to me, Thomas Owen." "Marry me," Thomas said. It was not a question, though he meant it as one. "I do not have much to offer, just $30 a month and a heart that is completely yours, but I swear I will spend every day trying to make you happy." "Yes," Katherine said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I will marry you, you ridiculous, wonderful man." They were married in January of 1874, in a simple ceremony at the small Catholic church in Cimarron. Henry Carson stood as Thomas's best man, and Mrs. Patterson, the boarding house owner, stood up for Katherine. The priest, Father Martinez, performed the ceremony in both English and Spanish, blessing their union with solemn gravity. Katherine wore a simple dress of cream-colored wool, and Thomas wore his best suit, purchased specifically for the occasion with money he had saved over months of work. When the priest pronounced them man and wife, Thomas kissed Katherine with such joy and tenderness that several of the attendees wiped away tears. The newlyweds moved into a small house on the edge of town, close enough for Katherine to walk to the newspaper office, but far enough to provide privacy. It was a modest dwelling with 2 rooms and a loft, but Katherine declared it perfect. Thomas continued working at the Carson Ranch, but now he came home every night to a warm house, a hot meal, and the woman he loved. It was everything he had never known he needed. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Thomas worked with the horses, bringing home his pay every month, and Katherine ran the newspaper, her editorials becoming increasingly sharp and well-regarded throughout the territory. They spent their evenings reading together, Thomas slowly improving his literacy under Katherine's patient tutelage, and their nights wrapped in each other's arms, learning the landscape of love and intimacy. But life in the New Mexico territory was never entirely peaceful. In March, a dispute arose between local ranchers and a group of settlers who had moved onto what the ranchers claimed was their land. Tensions escalated quickly, with threats of violence on both sides. Katherine, true to her nature, wrote a series of editorials calling for peaceful negotiation and rule of law. This did not sit well with everyone. Thomas was at the ranch when he heard the news. One of the other hands, a young man named Billy, rode in from town at a gallop, his face pale with urgency. "Thomas, you need to get to town now. There is trouble at the newspaper office." Thomas did not wait for details. He saddled Rosie and rode hard, arriving in Cimarron in half the usual time. A crowd had gathered outside the Chronicle, and through the press of bodies, Thomas could see 3 men confronting Katherine. The largest of them, a rancher named Dutch Morrison, was red-faced and shouting. "You have no right to publish lies about me," Morrison bellowed. "I have been working this land for 20 years, and no damned newspaper woman is going to tell me what I can and cannot do." "I publish the truth," Katherine said, her voice calm but firm. "You cannot simply drive settlers off their claims because you decide their land should be yours. There are laws, Mr. Morrison, and you are not above them." Morrison took a step forward, his hand moving toward his belt, and Thomas was suddenly there, positioning himself between the rancher and his wife. "I think you should leave," Thomas said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. Morrison looked Thomas up and down, assessing the threat. He was a big man, used to intimidating others, but something in Thomas's steady gaze made him reconsider. "This is not over," Morrison said finally. Your wife needs to learn to keep her opinions to herself. My wife has every right to her opinions and to publish them, Thomas said. Now leave before this gets ugly. For a tense moment, it seemed like Morrison might press the issue. Then, with a muttered curse, he turned and stalked away, his companions following. The crowd began to disperse, and Thomas turned to Katherine, who was pale but composed. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am fine," Katherine said, but her hands were shaking. "Thank you for coming." "Always," Thomas said, pulling her into his arms. "Always." That night, as they lay in bed, Katherine was quiet for a long time before speaking. "I am not going to stop writing the truth, Thomas, even if it makes people angry. That is not who I am." "I know," Thomas said, stroking her hair. "And I would never ask you to. I just want you to be safe." "I am safe with you," Katherine said, and kissed him. But the confrontation with Morrison had rattled Thomas more than he wanted to admit. The next day, he spoke with Henry Carson about the situation. The older man listened thoughtfully, then nodded. "Morrison is a bully, always has been. But he has friends, and some of them are not above using violence to get their way. You might want to talk to Sheriff Dalton, let him know what happened." Thomas did exactly that. Sheriff Dalton, a lean man with graying hair and a reputation for fairness, took the complaint seriously. "I will keep an eye on Morrison and his boys," the sheriff promised. "But you should know, feelings are running high right now. This land dispute is not going to resolve itself peacefully, no matter how many editorials your wife writes." "What do you think will happen?" Thomas asked. "Honestly, I think it will come to violence before it is over. I am doing everything I can to prevent that, but there are forces at work here bigger than one small town sheriff can handle." Dalton leaned back in his chair. "Best thing you can do is stay alert and keep your wife close. And maybe convince her to ease up on the editorials, just for a little while." Thomas knew better than to even try. Instead, he started accompanying Katherine to and from the newspaper office, and he kept his rifle close at hand. The tension in Cimarron continued to build throughout the spring, with both sides in the land dispute growing more entrenched. Katherine continued to write, calling for mediation and legal resolution, but her words seemed to fall on deaf ears. Then, in May, the situation erupted. A group of Morrison's men rode onto one of the disputed properties and burned down the settler's cabin. The family escaped unharmed, but the message was clear. The next day, Katherine published a scathing editorial condemning the attack and calling for Morrison's arrest. That afternoon, Morrison himself appeared at the newspaper office, this time with 5 men at his back. Thomas was there, having anticipated trouble. He stood beside Katherine, rifle in hand, as Morrison read the editorial with barely controlled rage. "You have gone too far this time," Morrison said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I could ruin you. I could burn this place to the ground just like that settler's cabin. Then you would prove everything my wife has written about you," Thomas said, "and you would hang for it. Sheriff Dalton is already looking for evidence to charge you with the cabin burning. Do not give him a reason to come after you for more." Morrison's face went purple with fury, but he was not stupid. He knew that attacking the newspaper office in broad daylight with witnesses would be the end of him. "This is not over," he said, but the words lacked conviction. He turned and left, his men trailing behind him. Sheriff Dalton arrived an hour later, having heard about the confrontation. "I have enough evidence to arrest Morrison," he told Thomas and Katherine. 3 witnesses saw his men burning that cabin. He will stand trial." "Will he hang?" Katherine asked. "That is for a jury to decide. But arson is a serious crime, and if the judge is fair, Morrison will spend years in prison." Dalton looked at Katherine with something like admiration. "Your articles helped. They documented the escalation, gave me a timeline to work with. You did good work, Mrs. Owen. Morrison was arrested the following day. His trial took place in June, and he was convicted of arson and intimidation. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in the territorial prison. With Morrison gone, the land dispute lost its main agitator, and cooler heads prevailed. A territorial land office surveyor was brought in to properly establish the boundaries, and most of the conflicts were resolved peacefully. Katherine's reputation as a journalist grew significantly. Papers from Santa Fe and even Albuquerque began reprinting her articles. She was offered a position at a larger paper in Santa Fe with twice the salary and more prestige. Thomas watched her read the offer letter, saw the flicker of temptation in her eyes, but when she looked up at him, he already knew her answer. "I cannot leave Cimarron," she said. "This is my home. Our home. The Chronicle is my father's legacy, and I cannot abandon it." "I would go with you if you wanted to accept," Thomas said. "I could find work in Santa Fe." "I know you would," Katherine said, setting the letter aside. "But I do not want that life. I want this life here with you. That is enough for me." They celebrated their decision that night, and in the months that followed, their happiness only deepened. In September, Katherine told Thomas she was pregnant. The news filled him with a joy so profound he could barely speak. He pulled her into his arms and held her for a long time, thinking about the child they would bring into the world, the family they were building together. The pregnancy was difficult. Katherine suffered from severe morning sickness that lasted well into her second trimester, and she grew weak and tired easily. Thomas insisted she reduce her hours at the newspaper, and for once, she did not argue. He hired a young man named Samuel to help with the printing press, giving Katherine the chance to rest more. As winter approached, Thomas found himself thinking often about that first day in Cimarron, standing in the rain, hearing Katherine's voice for the first time. It seemed like a lifetime ago, though less than 18 months had passed. So much had changed, yet the core feeling remained the same. Katherine was his home, his anchor, the center of his world. On a cold evening in December, almost exactly a year after their wedding, Katherine went into labor. Thomas rode for the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Henderson, and then did his best to stay out of the way while trying to be supportive. The labor lasted through the night and into the next morning. Thomas paced the small house, praying to a God he was not sure he believed in, bargaining and pleading for Katherine's safety. Finally, as the sun rose over the New Mexico hills, he heard the sharp, angry cry of a newborn baby. Mrs. Henderson emerged from the bedroom, her face tired but smiling. "You have a son," she said. "A healthy boy with strong lungs, and your wife is doing well, though she is exhausted." Thomas entered the bedroom to find Katherine propped up against pillows, her hair damp with sweat, her face pale but radiant. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. Thomas approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at his son for the first time. The baby had a shock of dark hair and Katherine's green eyes, which looked up at Thomas with unfocused wonder. Thomas felt tears running down his face, completely unashamed of the emotion overwhelming him. "He is perfect," Thomas whispered. "You are perfect. I love you so much." "I love you too," Katherine said, her voice hoarse. "Would you like to hold your son?" Thomas took the baby with careful hands, terrified he might somehow break this tiny, precious life. The infant settled against his chest, and Thomas felt something inside him click into place. A final piece of the puzzle he had not known was missing. They named him James, after Katherine's father, with the middle name Thomas. James Thomas Owen would grow up in Cimarron, surrounded by love and the smell of printer's ink, learning from his mother's intelligence and his father's gentle strength. The years that followed were good ones. The newspaper continued to thrive under Katherine's leadership, becoming one of the most respected publications in the territory. Thomas was promoted to foreman at the Carson Ranch, earning a salary that allowed them to expand their small house, adding more rooms for their growing family. 2 years after James was born, Katherine gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah, and 3 years after that, another son they called William. Thomas watched his children grow with a sense of wonder and gratitude he had never expected to experience. He taught James to ride and rope, passed on the skills his own father had taught him, but without the violence and anger that had poisoned his own childhood. Katherine taught all 3 children to read and write, instilling in them a love of learning and a respect for truth. On rainy days, Thomas would sometimes stand at the window and listen to Katherine sing. She no longer went out into the rain. Her singing was now reserved for the house, for their children, for him, but the voice was the same, pure and clear and full of emotion. And every time he heard it, Thomas was transported back to that first day in Cimarron, when a storm had brought him to the woman who would become his everything. The children grew older. James showed an interest in ranching, often accompanying Thomas to work on weekends and during school breaks. Sarah loved the newspaper, and by the time she was 12, she was already helping her mother with editing and typesetting. William was the quiet one, thoughtful and artistic, spending hours drawing the landscapes and people of Cimarron. New Mexico achieved statehood in 1882, and Cimarron celebrated with a grand festival. Katherine wrote a special edition of the Chronicle, chronicling the history of the town and the territory, and Thomas rode in a parade alongside other prominent citizens. It was a far cry from his days as a drifting cowboy, and sometimes Thomas had to pinch himself to believe this was his life. Henry Carson retired in 1885, selling the ranch to Thomas for a price far below its market value. "You earned this," Henry said when Thomas protested. "You have been like a son to me, and I know you will take care of the land and the animals. Besides, I am tired. I want to go back east and meet my grandchildren before I die." Thomas ran the ranch with the same fairness and integrity Henry had shown. He hired good men, paid them fairly, and treated them with respect. The ranch prospered, and the Owen name became synonymous with quality horses throughout New Mexico. Katherine continued running the Chronicle until 1890, when she finally agreed to let Sarah take over as editor. By then, Sarah was 21 years old, married to a lawyer named Robert Chambers, and more than capable of carrying on the family tradition. Katherine did not stop writing. She contributed regular columns and editorials, but she finally had time to pursue other interests. She started a library in Cimarron, convincing the town council to donate space and soliciting book donations from across the territory. Thomas and Katherine's love never diminished. If anything, it deepened with time, like a river carving its path through stone. They still took walks together, still talked for hours about everything and nothing. They weathered difficulties together. The death of Thomas's father in Texas, whom Thomas had not seen in years but mourned nonetheless. The financial panic of 1893 that briefly threatened the ranch. The usual trials and tribulations of raising 3 strong-willed children. Through it all, they remained each other's home, each other's refuge. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Thomas took Katherine back to the spot where they had first met, the muddy street where she had sung in the rain while he watched from under an overhang. It was a clear day, no rain in sight, but Katherine sang anyway, the same wordless melody she had sung all those years ago. And Thomas listened with the same sense of wonder and recognition. knowing that every mile of his long journey had been worth it to arrive at this moment, this place, this woman. James took over the ranch when Thomas turned 55, allowing Thomas to finally slow down and enjoy a semi-retirement. He still rode out to check on the horses most days, but he also spent long afternoons sitting with Katherine on their porch, watching the sun set over the New Mexico hills they had come to love. William had moved to Santa Fe to pursue his art, gaining recognition for his paintings of Western landscapes. Sarah continued to run the Chronicle with skill and passion, eventually passing it on to her own daughter when the time came. Thomas and Katherine became grandparents 7 times over, their small house frequently filled with the chaos and joy of visiting grandchildren. Thomas taught them all to ride, patient with their stumbles and fears, remembering his own childhood and determined to give them something better. Katherine read to them, told them stories, sang to them on rainy days. In 1910, as the old century gave way to the new, Thomas and Katherine celebrated their 36th wedding anniversary. They were both in their 60s now, hair gray, bodies slower, but their eyes still lit up when they looked at each other. That afternoon, as clouds gathered over Cimarron promising rain, Katherine turned to Thomas with a smile. "You remember the first time you heard me sing?" she asked. "Every detail," Thomas said. "You were standing in the middle of the street, face turned up to the sky, singing like you were the only person in the world. And I stood there like a fool, getting soaked, knowing I had found something I did not even know I was looking for. I was so angry when I realized you had been watching," Katherine said, laughing. "I thought you were some presumptuous cowboy who did not know proper boundaries." "I was a presumptuous cowboy who did not know proper boundaries," Thomas agreed. "But I was also a man who knew deep in his bones that he had found his home." The rain began to fall, gentle at first, then harder. Katherine stood, moving to the edge of the porch, and began to sing. Her voice was older now, not quite as pure as it had been, but still beautiful, still full of emotion. Thomas stood beside her, his arm around her waist, and listened. The song was the same one she had been singing that first day, all those years ago. Thomas had learned over time that it was a melody her mother had taught her, passed down through generations, words in a language Katherine did not even know. But the meaning was clear in every note. It was a song about longing and hope, about loss and redemption, about finding your way home. As Katherine sang, Thomas thought about the improbable journey that had brought them together. A rainstorm and a song, a cowboy and a newspaper woman, 2 lonely souls finding each other in a small town in the New Mexico territory. It should not have worked. The odds had been against them from the start. But love, real love, the kind that lasted through decades and difficulties, did not care about odds or logic. It simply was. The rain continued to fall, and Katherine continued to sing, and Thomas held her close, grateful for every moment, every challenge, every joy they had shared. This was his home, not a place but a person, not a destination but a journey they had taken together. They lived another 10 years, Thomas and Katherine Owen, dying within months of each other as old couples sometimes do, as if neither could bear to exist in a world without the other. They were buried side by side in the Cimarron cemetery, their headstones simple but well tended by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried forward their legacy of love and integrity. The Chronicle continued publication for another 50 years before finally closing its doors, unable to compete with radio and television. But by then, the Owen name was firmly established in New Mexico history. The ranch remained in the family, passed down through generations, and travelers through northern New Mexico can still see the sign at the gate that reads Owen Ranch, established 1885. But the real legacy of Thomas and Katherine Owen was not measured in land or publications, or even in the numerous descendants who carried their name. Their legacy was the story itself, the tale of a cowboy who heard a woman singing in the rain and knew he had found his home, and a woman who had given up on love until a stranger stood in the storm and saw her for exactly who she was. It was a story told and retold, embellished and simplified, but always returning to that core truth. Love, when it is real, feels like coming home. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren would ask in later years how Thomas had known, how he had been so certain after hearing Katherine sing just once that she was the one. And those who remembered him, who had heard the story from his own lips, would repeat his answer. I had been looking for home my whole life without knowing it. And when I heard her voice cutting through that rain, something in me recognized something in her, like two parts of the same song finding each other at last. I cannot explain it better than that. Some things just are, and you either trust them or spend your whole life wondering what if. Katherine's answer when asked the same question was equally simple. Thomas saw me, really saw me, at a time when I felt invisible to the world. He did not want to change me or fix me or make me into something I was not. He just wanted to know me, to stand beside me, to build a life together. That is not as romantic as love at first sight, perhaps, but it is more lasting, and in the end, that is what matters. Together, their answers painted a complete picture of what love truly was: recognition and acceptance, mystery and certainty, passion and partnership. It was not perfect. They had argued and struggled and faced challenges like any couple, but it was real and deep and true. It was the kind of love that lasted, that built families and communities, that left the world a little bit better than it had been. On rainy days in Cimarron, some of the older residents swear they can still hear singing, faint and distant, as if Katherine's voice has somehow soaked into the very earth of the town. It is probably just the wind, or memory playing tricks, or the too human desire to believe that love never truly ends. But then again, maybe some bonds are strong enough to transcend death, to leave an echo that lingers long after the voices have fallen silent. The story of Thomas and Katherine Owen became part of Cimarron's folklore, told alongside tales of outlaws and gunfights and the rough days of the frontier. But unlike those other stories, which faded with time, growing less relevant as the world changed, the love story endured. Because however much the world changes, people still long for connection, still hope to find that one person who feels like home, still dream of hearing a voice in the rain that speaks directly to their soul. And sometimes in small towns across the West, in Cimarron and 1,000 places like it, that dream comes true. A stranger arrives, a song is sung, two hearts recognize each other, and a new story begins. Not all of them last as long as Thomas and Katherine's. Not all of them weather the storms as well, but each one is its own small miracle, its own defiance of the odds. The rain still falls on Cimarron, as it always has and always will. The seasons turn, the town grows and changes. Old buildings are torn down and new ones erected. But the essential character of the place remains, shaped by the people who lived and loved and struggled there. People like Thomas and Katherine Owen, who took a chance on each other and built something lasting from faith and hope and hard work. In the end, that is what any of us can hope for. To find someone who feels like home, to build a life together that matters, to leave behind a legacy of love that continues long after we are gone. Thomas and Katherine Owen achieved all of that and more, And their story stands as a testament to the enduring power of love to transform lives and give meaning to even the loneliest existence. The cowboy listened to the woman singing in the rain and knew he had found his home. It was as simple and as profound as that. And for 36 years of marriage and many more years of legacy, that simple truth sustained them, guided them, and reminded them that the best things in life often come when we least expect them, carried on the wind and rain of an ordinary day that becomes extraordinary through the alchemy of love.